Antonio Rivera had been marking time at Millbrook State Correctional for exactly 892 days when he first saw the man they called Beast trying to hide the pain that contorted his face every time he swallowed food. Not because Antonio was eager for freedom, he still had 3 years, 4 months, and 17 days remaining on his sentence for tax evasion and wire fraud. He marked time because precision had always been his salvation in chaos. In his former life, precision had meant temperature control to the exact degree, timing measured in seconds, and the careful orchestration of ingredients that transformed simple components into experiences that brought tears to the eyes of food critics and common diners alike. At 46, Antonio carried himself with the quiet intensity of someone who had spent 22 years perfecting the art of nourishment under the most demanding conditions imaginable. His salt and pepper hair was now longer than it had been in his pristine kitchen days. His hands bore burns and cuts that spoke of learning to work with inferior equipment, and his eyes held the particular sadness that came from watching people destroy their bodies with substances that should heal rather than harm. Prison had not killed his passion for feeding people, but it had taught him that sometimes the most important meals were the ones that saved lives rather than earned stars. But Antonio Rivera was not just any chef. Before the Michelin stars, before the celebrity status, before the restaurants that required reservations booked months in advance, Antonio had spent 8 years as a field chef in the Army Special Forces. He had fed soldiers in Afghanistan, Iraq, and classified locations where proper nutrition could mean the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures. He had learned to create nourishing meals from combat rations, to identify and treat malnutrition in hostile environments, and to understand that food was medicine as much as fuel. His crime had been born from a desperation that few could understand. When his daughter Elena was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder that required experimental treatments not covered by insurance, Antonio had started skimming cash receipts from his restaurants and falsifying tax documents to fund her medical care. The treatments had bought Elena 3 additional years of life, allowing her to graduate high school and experience her first year of college before the disease finally claimed her. The investigation that brought him down revealed a complex fraud scheme worth over $2 million, every penny of which had gone to medical bills and Elena's education fund. What Antonio hadn't expected was how dramatically his world would shrink from commanding kitchens that fed hundreds of wealthy diners to standing in line with men whose bodies were slowly being poisoned by years of institutional food designed for cost efficiency rather than human health. The irony was devastating. A man who had dedicated his life to nourishment was now trapped in a system that treated food as nothing more than cheap fuel to keep bodies alive until their sentences were complete. For the first 18 months of his sentence, Antonio had worked in the prison laundry, folding sheets and towels while listening to conversations that revealed the complex relationship between food, power, and survival in the facility. He had watched men fight over portions of food that wouldn't qualify as edible outside these walls. He had seen inmates trade cigarettes for extra servings of meals that provided minimal nutrition and maximum institutional control. Most troubling, he had observed the systematic deterioration of men's health as their bodies struggled to function on diets that met caloric requirements while ignoring every other aspect of human nutritional need. The opportunity to work in the prison kitchen came through a bureaucratic accident. The facility needed someone with food service experience to help supervise meal preparation, and Antonio's restaurant background made him technically qualified despite his complete lack of institutional cooking experience. He had accepted the position understanding that he would be working with ingredients, equipment, and standards that would have horrified him in his previous life, but also recognizing that this might be his only chance to address the nutritional crisis he had been witnessing for over a year. The prison kitchen was exactly what Antonio had expected, a sterile, efficient operation designed to produce maximum calories at minimum cost. Industrial steamers, oversized pots, and preparation surfaces that had been sanitized into flavorless submission. But it was also something that gradually revealed itself to be far more interesting, a complex ecosystem where small changes in preparation, seasoning, and presentation could dramatically impact the physical and psychological well-being of over 800 men. Antonio approached his new role with the same systematic attention to detail that had earned him international recognition as a chef. But instead of focusing on flavor profiles and presentation aesthetics, he began studying the nutritional deficiencies that were epidemic among the prison population. Men with chronic digestive issues, persistent fatigue, mood disorders that worsened with poor nutrition, and immune systems compromised by years of eating food that provided energy without nourishment. Within weeks, Antonio had begun making subtle modifications to standard recipes, adding small amounts of herbs and spices that provided essential nutrients, adjusting cooking methods to preserve vitamins that were typically destroyed during institutional food preparation, introducing fermented vegetables that could improve digestive health without exceeding budget constraints. The changes were so subtle that most inmates didn't consciously notice them, but their bodies began responding to the improved nutrition in ways that created ripple effects throughout the facility. It started with digestive improvements. Men who had suffered from chronic stomach pain for years began experiencing relief. Inmates with persistent skin conditions saw their symptoms diminish. Energy levels increased, mood stabilized, and even minor infections seemed to heal more quickly. Word spread through the prison with the characteristic speed of any significant change in daily routine, but the whispered conversations were about feeling better rather than tasting better, an important distinction in a place where showing appreciation for anything could be interpreted as weakness. Miguel Santos, a 34-year-old serving time for drug dealing, had been one of the first to notice the changes. He approached Antonio during a quiet moment in the kitchen, his expression cautious but curious. "I don't know what you're doing different," Miguel had said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening, "but I haven't had stomach problems in weeks. First time in years I can eat without pain following after." Antonio had smiled while continuing to chop vegetables, understanding that Miguel was taking a risk by acknowledging the improvement. "Sometimes small changes make big differences," he had replied quietly. "Bodies want to heal if you give them what they need." It wasn't therapy, but it was healing. Miguel had never thought of food as medicine before, but he was beginning to understand that the relationship between what you ate and how you felt was more complex than he had ever imagined. But Antonio's growing reputation as someone who could improve the quality of institutional food also attracted attention from quarters that viewed any change in the established order as a potential threat to existing power structures. And in Millbrook State Correctional, no one represented established power more completely than the man every inmate knew as Beast. Marcus "Beast" Williams had controlled the flow of contraband food, supplements and cooking supplies for over 6 years through a combination of strategic intimidation and carefully managed violence. At 6 feet 5 inches and nearly 300 pounds of muscle, Beast's physical presence was intimidating enough, but what made him truly dangerous was his understanding of how to weaponize hunger, nutrition, and the basic human need for comfort food in an environment where such comforts were rare and precious. Beast had built his empire on the simple premise that men would do almost anything for access to food that reminded them of life outside prison walls. He controlled the supply of ingredients that could transform institutional slop into something resembling real meals. He determined who got access to protein powder, vitamin supplements, and the occasional fresh fruit that found its way into the facility through channels that guards pretended not to notice. His power came from his ability to provide what the institution denied: dignity through nutrition, comfort through flavor, and status through access to food that made you feel human rather than just housed. What bothered Beast about Antonio's innovations wasn't the improved nutrition, it was the way these improvements were reducing demand for the premium food services that Beast controlled. Men who were feeling healthier from institutional meals were less desperate for supplements and contraband ingredients. Inmates who were experiencing digestive relief weren't willing to pay inflated prices for antacids and stomach remedies. Antonio's subtle improvements were threatening Beast's carefully constructed monopoly on everything that made prison food bearable. But Beast was also suffering from something he had never admitted to anyone: chronic pain that made every meal a test of endurance rather than a source of nourishment. For over 10 years he had been living with severe gastritis, stomach ulcers, and digestive inflammation that turned eating into an ordeal of burning pain and nausea. He had learned to hide his suffering behind his intimidating exterior, but the reality was that Beast could barely tolerate the very food empire he had built his reputation on controlling. The confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon when Antonio was alone in the kitchen, preparing vegetables for the evening meal. He had been working in the quiet space, surrounded by the familiar rhythms of chopping, stirring, and seasoning that connected him to every kitchen he had ever commanded, when Beast appeared in the doorway without warning. The sudden presence of the most feared man in Millbrook transformed the sanctuary into a space charged with potential violence. "Well, well, well," Beast announced, his voice carrying the casual authority that had intimidated countless inmates over the years. "If it isn't Millbrook's newest gourmet chef, Antonio Rivera, right? I hear you've been making some interesting modifications to the standard menu around here." Antonio looked up from the onions he was dicing, his expression calm despite the obvious threat implicit in Beast's tone and unexpected presence in his kitchen. "I follow the recipes I'm given," Antonio said simply, his voice steady despite his awareness that this conversation could determine the future of everything he had been quietly building. "Sometimes I adjust seasoning levels or cooking times based on the equipment we're working with, small modifications to ensure food safety and nutritional value." The response was delivered with the professional composure that Antonio had learned during years of dealing with difficult suppliers, demanding customers, and health inspectors who could shut down operations with a single violation. "Small modifications," Beast repeated, stepping into the kitchen and closing the door behind him. His massive frame seemed to fill the entire space, making the industrial equipment look almost delicate by comparison.
That's an interesting way to describe what you've been doing, because from where I stand, it looks like you've been systematically undermining the food economy that keeps order in this facility. Antonio continued chopping vegetables, his knife work precise and controlled despite the tension that was building in the room. I'm not trying to undermine anything, he said calmly. I'm just trying to make sure the food we serve provides adequate nutrition for the men who have to eat it every day. Better nutrition means better health, which benefits everyone in the facility. Beast moved closer to Antonio's prep station, his imposing presence creating a shadow across the cutting board and ingredient containers. Better health, he said mockingly. You think these men deserve better health? You think this place is supposed to be some kind of health spa where everyone gets gourmet meals and nutritional counseling? This is prison, chef. The food is supposed to keep them alive, not make them happy. The philosophy behind Beast's objection revealed something important about his worldview. He believed that suffering was an essential component of punishment, that making prison life more bearable was equivalent to reducing the deterrent effect of incarceration. But Antonio had spent enough time in combat zones to understand that hungry, malnourished men were more dangerous than well-fed ones, not less. I understand your perspective, Antonio replied, setting down his knife and turning to face Beast directly. But I've worked in environments where nutrition directly impacts behavior, decision-making, and conflict resolution. Malnourished men are more aggressive, less rational, and more likely to make choices that hurt themselves and others. Good nutrition doesn't make prison soft, it makes it manageable. Beast studied Antonio's face, searching for signs of condescension or naive idealism that might justify a more aggressive response. But Antonio's calm explanation of the relationship between nutrition and behavior was based on experience rather than theory, and his military bearing was becoming more apparent the longer they talked. This wasn't some soft civilian chef trying to turn prison into a restaurant. This was someone who understood dangerous environments and the role that proper nutrition played in surviving them. Dangerous environments, Beast said, his voice losing some of its earlier hostility. You talk like you know something about that. Most chefs I've met couldn't survive a day in a place like this without someone protecting them. But you seem different, comfortable, like you've been in worse situations before. The observation was both a question and a challenge, an invitation for Antonio to explain what had prepared him for life in prison. Antonio recognized the shift in Beast's tone and understood that this was a crucial moment in their interaction. I spent 8 years as a field chef in the army, he said quietly. Special Forces operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. I learned how to feed soldiers in combat zones, how to maintain nutrition when supply lines were cut, how to identify and treat malnutrition when medical resources were limited. This kitchen is actually one of the safest places I've ever worked. The revelation changed everything about how Beast was processing this conversation. Special Forces meant someone who had been through selection, training, and deployment experiences that most people couldn't imagine. Field chef meant someone who had kept soldiers alive under conditions where failure meant death rather than just hunger. Antonio wasn't just a civilian chef who had gotten caught breaking tax laws. He was a combat veteran who understood survival in ways that commanded respect even in prison. Special Forces, Beast repeated, his voice now carrying genuine interest rather than threat. That explains why you move like you know what you're doing in here. But it also makes me wonder why someone with your background ended up in minimum security on white-collar charges. Doesn't add up. The statement was an invitation for Antonio to share more of his story, but it was also a test to see whether his military credentials were legitimate or fabricated. Antonio understood that Beast was evaluating him based on criteria that had nothing to do with cooking ability and everything to do with credibility in environments where deception could be fatal. My daughter had a rare autoimmune disorder, Antonio said, his voice steady despite the pain that talking about Elena always brought. Insurance wouldn't cover the experimental treatments she needed. I started skimming cash and falsifying taxes to pay for her medical care. She lived 3 years longer than doctors expected, but the investigation eventually caught up with me. The honesty in Antonio's explanation hit Beast like a physical blow. He had expected some story about greed or poor financial decisions, but this was something entirely different. A father who had sacrificed everything legal to save his child's life. Beast understood that kind of desperation, that willingness to accept any consequence if it meant protecting someone you loved more than your own safety or reputation. How old was she? Beast asked, his voice smaller than it had been since entering the kitchen. The question revealed something vulnerable beneath his intimidating exterior, a crack in the armor that suggested this conversation was affecting him more deeply than he had expected. Antonio set down his knife and met Beast's eyes directly. 21 when she died, Antonio said quietly. She got to graduate high school, experience her first year of college, fall in love, write poetry, travel to places she had dreamed about visiting. The treatments didn't save her life, but they gave her time to actually live it. That was worth everything it cost me. The pain in Antonio's voice was genuine and profound, the grief of a father who had lost the most important person in his world. Beast was quiet for a long moment, his massive frame seeming to deflate slightly as he processed Antonio's story. I'm sorry, he said finally, the words carrying more weight than most apologies because they came from someone who rarely expressed sympathy for anyone. That kind of loss, that changes everything about how you see the world. Antonio nodded, understanding that Beast was sharing something of his own experience with devastating loss. It changes your priorities, Antonio agreed. Makes you understand that taking care of people is more important than following rules that don't account for human need. That's why I do what I do in this kitchen. These men may be here because they made mistakes, but they're still human beings who deserve food that nourishes them rather than just filling space in their stomachs. Beast struggled with the philosophical challenge that Antonio was presenting. His entire power structure was built on the premise that prison was supposed to be punitive, that comfort and nourishment were privileges to be earned rather than rights to be expected. But Antonio was suggesting that basic human dignity could coexist with accountability, that punishment didn't require deliberate suffering to be effective. You really think better food makes better men? Beast asked, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than skepticism. You think feeding someone properly changes who they are, how they behave, whether they come back to this place after they get out?
The questions revealed that Beast was struggling with deeper issues about redemption, change, and whether people were capable of becoming better than their worst actions. I think malnutrition makes everything worse, Antonio replied. Hunger creates desperation. Poor nutrition affects brain function, emotional regulation, decision-making capability. You can't expect people to make better choices when their bodies and minds aren't getting what they need to function properly. Good food isn't a reward, it's a foundation for everything else. As Antonio spoke, he noticed Beast unconsciously pressing his hand against his stomach, a gesture so brief that most people would have missed it. That's quite a philosophy, Beast said, but his voice was strained in a way that suggested he was dealing with physical discomfort rather than just intellectual disagreement. Very idealistic for someone who's been in combat zones. Most military guys I know understand that sometimes suffering is necessary to build character, teach discipline, create respect for consequences. The words were tough, but Beast's posture was betraying signs of pain that he was trying to hide. Antonio's trained eye caught the subtle indicators of digestive distress, the way Beast was breathing, the slight pallor beneath his dark skin, the careful way he was holding his torso to minimize movement that might aggravate internal pain. After 22 years of observing how people's bodies responded to different foods, Antonio could recognize the signs of chronic gastric inflammation as easily as most people could identify a common cold. You're right that discipline and consequences matter, Antonio said carefully, understanding that he was about to venture into territory that could either build trust or create dangerous offense. But there's a difference between constructive consequences and destructive ones. When was the last time you had a meal that didn't cause you pain? The question was asked with the matter-of-fact directness of a medical professional rather than the invasive curiosity of someone seeking weakness to exploit. Beast's entire body went rigid, his eyes narrowing as he processed the fact that Antonio had somehow identified a vulnerability that Beast had been hiding for years. "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice carrying a warning that this line of inquiry was approaching dangerous territory. "I don't have any problems with food. I eat what everyone else eats, same as always." But the denial was undermined by the defensive way he was holding his posture. "Gastritis, probably chronic," Antonio said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had diagnosed and treated nutritional problems in environments where medical care was limited. "Stomach ulcers, digestive inflammation, possibly intestinal issues that make eating feel like swallowing acid. You've been dealing with it for years, hiding it because showing weakness isn't an option in your position, but it's getting worse because the institutional food here is designed to aggravate exactly those conditions." The accuracy of Antonio's diagnosis hit Beast like a physical assault. No one was supposed to know about the constant pain that made every meal an endurance test, the burning sensation that kept him awake at night, the nausea that he fought through sheer willpower because vomiting would reveal vulnerability that could destroy his reputation. "How did you grind?" Beast started to ask, then stopped himself before admitting that Antonio was correct. "I spent years learning to identify malnutrition and dietary health issues in soldiers who couldn't afford to admit they were struggling," Antonio explained. "Your body language when you're around food, the way you breathe when you're eating, the careful way you position yourself to minimize digestive discomfort, those are signs I was trained to recognize and address before they became mission-threatening problems." Beast stood in the kitchen, his massive frame trembling with the effort of maintaining control while confronting the reality that his carefully hidden suffering had been identified by someone who might actually be able to help. "Even if that were true," he said through gritted teeth, "what difference would it make? This place doesn't exactly offer gourmet medical cuisine for inmates with digestive issues. We eat what we get, and we deal with whatever problems that causes. Actually, there's quite a bit we can do with the ingredients and preparation methods available here," Antonio said, moving to the refrigeration unit and pulling out several items that most people would have dismissed as basic cooking supplies. "Anti-inflammatory spices, alkaline vegetables that can neutralize stomach acid, preparation techniques that make food easier to digest. I've been making small modifications for other men with similar issues. The changes are subtle, but the relief is significant. Beast watched as Antonio arranged ingredients with the precision of a pharmacist preparing medication: fresh ginger, turmeric, leafy greens that had somehow avoided the overprocessing that characterized most prison vegetables, herbs that could soothe digestive inflammation rather than aggravating it. "You're talking about treating medical conditions with cooking," Beast said, his voice carrying a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. "I'm talking about nutrition as medicine," Antonio corrected. "Food as healing rather than just fuel. Your body has been under attack from institutional food that's designed for shelf stability and cost control rather than human health. But if we can modify your diet to include ingredients that reduce inflammation and support digestive healing, you might be able to eat without pain for the first time in years." As he spoke, Antonio began preparing a simple meal using techniques he had learned in field hospitals where proper medicine was unavailable. The preparation process was almost meditative. Vegetables cut to maximize nutrient availability, spices combined in proportions that would maximize anti-inflammatory effects, cooking methods that preserve digestive enzymes rather than destroying them. Beast watched with growing fascination as Antonio transformed basic prison ingredients into something that looked and smelled like actual medicine. "This is for you," Antonio said, plating the finished dish with the same care he had once used for Michelin-starred presentations. "It's designed specifically for chronic gastritis and digestive inflammation. The ingredients will neutralize excess stomach acid, the spices will reduce inflammation, and the preparation method makes it easy for your system to process without triggering pain responses." He set the plate in front of Beast like he was presenting a prescription rather than a meal. Beast stared at the food with a mixture of suspicion and desperate hunger. He hadn't eaten a pain-free meal in over 10 years. The idea that someone could create food that would heal rather than hurt seemed too good to be true, but the professional way Antonio had prepared it suggested this wasn't just wishful thinking. "What if this doesn't work?" Beast asked. "What if I eat this and it just causes more problems?" "Then we modify the approach until we find what does work," Antonio said with the patience of someone who understood that healing was often a process of trial and refinement rather than immediate success. "But I've used these techniques with soldiers who had similar digestive damage from combat stress and poor field nutrition. The principles are sound, even if we need to adjust the specifics for your particular situation." Beast picked up the fork with hands that trembled slightly from a combination of hope and fear. The first bite was cautious, almost suspicious, as he waited for the familiar burning sensation that had accompanied eating for over a decade. But instead of pain, there was just food. Nourishing, flavorful food that his stomach accepted without rebellion. The second bite was more confident. The third almost eager. For the first time in years, Beast was eating with pleasure rather than endurance. "This is impossible," Beast said through tears he didn't realize were falling. "Food isn't supposed to feel like this. Eating isn't supposed to be comfortable." I'd forgotten that meals could be something other than punishment. The emotional breakthrough was as significant as the physical relief. Beast was rediscovering what it felt like to nourish his body rather than just fuel it for survival. Antonio watched Beast's transformation with the satisfaction that had originally drawn him to cooking, the profound joy of seeing someone experience healing through food. "Your body wants to heal," Antonio said quietly. "It's been fighting inflammation and damage for years, but it will respond to proper nutrition if we give it the right tools. This isn't just about tonight's meal, it's about creating an ongoing nutritional protocol that can help your digestive system recover." Over the following weeks, an extraordinary partnership began to develop between Antonio and Beast. The feared gang leader didn't abandon his position of authority, but he started using his influence to protect and expand Antonio's nutritional innovations. Instead of viewing better food as a threat to prison discipline, Beast began promoting proper nutrition as a form of strategic preparation for successful re-entry into civilian life. Most remarkably, Beast became Antonio's most dedicated collaborator in developing specialized nutritional protocols for inmates with various health issues. His organizational skills and understanding of prison social dynamics proved invaluable in implementing dietary changes that could help men with diabetes, hypertension, digestive disorders, and other conditions that were epidemic in the prison population but rarely addressed through nutrition. But Beast's most significant transformation came when Antonio suggested that he help teach other inmates about the relationship between nutrition and health. "I don't know anything about cooking," Beast had protested initially. "I've never been interested in food beyond using it to maintain my position. How can I teach people about something I never understood myself?" Antonio helped Beast understand that his credibility as a leader and his personal experience with nutritional healing made him uniquely qualified to reach men who might dismiss traditional health education as irrelevant to their situations. "You understand what it's like to suffer from conditions that no one talks about," Antonio explained. "You know what it feels like to hide pain because admitting weakness isn't safe. Those experiences make you more qualified to help others than any formal training could. Beast's first attempt at nutritional education was revolutionary. Speaking to a group of inmates with chronic health conditions, he talked about his years of hidden suffering, his discovery that food could be medicine rather than just survival fuel, and his gradual understanding that taking care of your body was a form of strength rather than weakness. His willingness to be vulnerable about his health struggles gave other men permission to acknowledge their own needs without shame. The program that Antonio and Beast developed together became known throughout the correctional system as tactical nutrition, an approach that framed proper eating as strategic preparation for success rather than medical treatment for illness. Beast's leadership gave the program credibility with men who might otherwise have viewed health education as irrelevant to their concerns, while Antonio's expertise ensured that the nutritional recommendations were sound and achievable within prison constraints. 6 months after their first confrontation, Beast approached Antonio with a proposal that would have been unthinkable when they first met. "I want to expand this program to other facilities," he said. "There are thousands of inmates throughout the system who are dealing with preventable health problems because no one has ever taught them that food can be medicine. We could train other kitchen workers and inmate leaders to implement nutritional protocols that could change lives." Antonio recognized the profound vision in Beast's proposal. Most prison health programs focused on treating diseases after they developed rather than preventing them through proper nutrition. But a system-wide approach to therapeutic nutrition could address the root causes of many health problems that made re-entry more difficult and recidivism more likely. The Therapeutic Nutrition Network became Beast's mission and redemption story. He developed training materials for kitchen staff and inmate health advocates, created distribution systems for specialized nutritional protocols, and built relationships with medical professionals who could provide oversight and validation for the program's expansion. The measurable improvements in inmate health, behavior, and successful re-entry made the program a model for correctional systems nationwide. When Antonio was released after serving his full sentence, he left behind more than just a successful prison nutrition program. He had helped create a culture where health was valued as preparation for success, rather than luxury for the privileged, where taking care of your body was seen as responsibility rather than weakness, where the most respected leader in the facility was someone who had transformed himself by learning to heal rather than just survive. Beast still had 8 years remaining on his sentence, but he spent that time differently than he had spent the previous 6 years of incarceration. He earned certifications in nutrition education and health advocacy, developed partnerships with medical organizations that could provide continued support for former inmates, and created comprehensive re-entry programs that addressed the health challenges that often contributed to recidivism. 3 years after Antonio's release, Beast sent him a letter written in careful handwriting that showed the results of educational programs he had embraced as part of his own transformation. "Antonio," the letter read, "I wanted to tell you about something that happened this week. The prison doctor reported that diagnosed cases of diabetes, hypertension, and digestive disorders have dropped by 40% since we implemented the Therapeutic Nutrition Network. Men who used to spend their commissary money on antacids and pain medication are now requesting fresh vegetables and anti-inflammatory spices. But the most important thing is that they're learning to see their bodies as something worth taking care of, rather than just vehicles for surviving their sentences. You didn't just heal my stomach, you taught me that healing others was a better form of power than controlling them through fear." Antonio kept that letter framed in his office at the nutrition therapy center he established after his release, a reminder that healing was never just about individual recovery, it was about understanding that nourishment was a fundamental human right, that health was a foundation for all other forms of growth and change. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is someone who has never learned that their body deserves care, someone who has accepted that suffering is normal, someone who believes that healing is a luxury they don't deserve. Years later, when people asked Antonio about his time in prison, he would tell them about the kitchen where transformation happened one meal at a time, one nutritional protocol at a time, one moment of pain-free eating at a time. Not the dramatic kind of transformation that happened in movies, but the slow, deliberate process of learning to see food as medicine rather than just fuel, learning to understand that caring for your body was the foundation for caring for everything else in your life. He would tell them about Beast, the man who had ruled through intimidation, until he learned that his greatest strength wasn't his ability to control others through fear, but his ability to help them discover that their bodies were worth healing, their health was worth protecting, their lives were worth nourishing. About men who discovered that asking for help with health problems was a sign of wisdom rather than weakness, that taking care of themselves was preparation for taking care of their families and communities after release. Most of all, Antonio would tell them about the lesson he learned in that industrial kitchen, that food isn't just about taste or sustenance, it's about showing someone they deserve to be nourished, that their body is worth caring for, that healing is always possible when you have the right ingredients and the patience to let them work. Because when you teach someone that their body deserves proper nutrition, you're not just improving their physical health,
You're teaching them that they have value beyond their mistakes, that they deserve investment rather than just punishment, that they are worth the effort it takes to heal completely rather than just survive until tomorrow. The strongest prisons are not made of concrete and steel. They are built from the belief that some people don't deserve comfort, that suffering is justice, that punishment requires the deliberate withholding of care and nourishment. But Antonio Rivera learned in that prison kitchen that every person deserves food that heals rather than harms, nutrition that builds rather than destroys, meals that remind them of their humanity rather than their failures. Because when you feed someone properly, you're not just filling their stomach, you're telling them that their life has value, their health matters, and their future is worth the ingredients it takes to build it properly, one nutritious meal at a time.